The end of the 1960s was a time of profound contradiction. In Northern California, the air itself seemed charged with a revolutionary energy. It was the heartland of the counterculture, a vibrant tapestry woven with the threads of peace, love, and psychedelic exploration. The Grateful Dead's music drifted from open windows in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, a neighborhood that had, just a year or two before, been the epicenter of the summer of love. Young people with flowers in their hair preached a gospel of cosmic unity, a rejection of the buttoned-down conservatism of their parents' generation. The promise was of a dawning age of Aquarius, a brighter, more enlightened future for all. But beneath this sun-drenched idealism, a darker current was gathering strength. The dream was beginning to fray at the edges. The war in Vietnam raged on, a bloody and divisive conflict that sent a generation of young men to faraway jungles and brought images of unimaginable horror into American living rooms every evening. At home, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had shattered the nation's sense of stability, revealing a deep well of anger and violence. The Manson family was coalescing in the Southern California desert, their twisted version of the hippie ethos curdling into something murderous. The utopian promise of the counterculture was revealing its dark side, a landscape of bad trips, disillusionment, and paranoia. This was the California of 1968, a place of dizzying highs and terrifying lows, of boundless optimism, shadowed by a creeping dread. It was a world of dualities, light and dark, peace and violence, love and hate. And it was into this fractured, uncertain world that a new kind of monster emerged. He was not a creature of political ideology or cultish devotion. He was something more primal, a phantom who stalked the quiet, lonely places where the bright lights of the city gave way to darkness. He targeted the most vulnerable, the young lovers parked in their cars, seeking a moment of privacy on a dark lover's lane. His terror did not begin with a grand declaration or a manifesto. It began with the deafening crack of a pistol in the cold December night, a sound that ripped through the quiet stillness of a lover's lane on the outskirts of Vallejo, a blue-collar Navy town on the edge of the San Francisco Bay. The first attack was brutal, efficient, and seemingly random. There was no robbery, no apparent motive beyond the act of killing itself. It was an act of pure predatory violence that left a community stunned and a police department with almost nothing to go on. For months, this act of violence would remain a horrifying but isolated incident, a local tragedy mourned by the families of two teenagers whose lives had been stolen from them. But the silence was a lie. The killer was watching, waiting, and planning. He was not content to remain a shadow. He craved a stage, an audience for his reign of terror. He wanted more than just victims. He wanted fame. He wanted the world to know his name. But he would not give them one. Instead, he would give them a symbol. A simple, chilling design. A circle with a cross drawn through it, like the crosshairs of a rifle scope. This is the story of the man who called himself the Zodiac. He was a murderer, a terrorist, and a master manipulator who held Northern California in a grip of fear for years. He communicated with the public through taunting letters to the press, filled with cryptic clues, bizarre demands, and complex ciphers that he claimed held the key to his identity. He played a deadly game with the police, the media, and the public, always seeming to be one step ahead, reveling in the chaos he created. He turned the entire Bay Area into his personal hunting ground, a place where a ringing payphone or a letter in the mail could bring a fresh wave of panic. This story is not just about the murders. It is about the era that gave birth to such a monster. It is about the lives he shattered, the victims, their families, and the survivors who would forever carry the scars of their encounters. It is about the dedicated, often overwhelmed detectives who hunted him, sifting through a mountain of false leads and public hysteria in a pre-digital age. And it is about the mystery itself, an enigma that has captivated and terrified the public for over half a century. The Zodiac Killer was never caught. His identity remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of American crime. He vanished as mysteriously as he appeared, leaving behind a legacy of fear, a handful of cryptic clues, and a question that still echoes through the fog-shrouded hills of Northern California. Who was the Zodiac? The hunt for the answer begins on a cold, dark road where the hopeful dreams of the 1960s came to a violent and sudden end. The city of Vallejo, California, sits at the northeastern edge of the San Pablo Bay, a working-class town whose fortunes have long been tied to the Mare Island Naval Shipyard. In the late 1960s, it was a place of modest homes, bustling docks, and a culture that felt a world away from the psychedelic scene unfolding across the water in San Francisco. For the teenagers of Vallejo, life was simpler. It revolved around high school, part-time jobs, and the timeless ritual of the weekend date. For young couples, privacy was a precious commodity, often found in the quiet, unlit turnouts along the winding back roads that spiderwebbed through the surrounding hills. One such place was Lake Herman Road. By day, it was a scenic drive, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through rolling, golden hills dotted with oak trees. But by night, it transformed. Streetlights were non-existent, and the few isolated farmhouses were set far back from the road. It was a place of profound darkness and silence, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional rumble of a passing car. It was known locally as a lover's lane, a place where a boy could steal a kiss and a girl could rest her head on his shoulder, the glowing dials of the dashboard providing the only light. On the evening of Friday, December 20th, 1968, just 5 days before Christmas, this secluded road became the setting for a tragedy that would mark the beginning of a reign of terror. The victims were David Arthur Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16. They were, by all accounts, wonderful kids. David was a clean-cut, popular student at Vallejo High, an Eagle Scout who was a member of the wrestling team and the school choir. He was earnest and hard-working, recently having bought and restored a 1961 Rambler station wagon with his own money. Betty Lou lived just 2 blocks from him and was a student at Hogan High. She was bright, bubbly, and well-liked, known for her warm smile. This was her very first date. Her parents were strict, and she had to plead with them to let her go out with David to a Christmas concert at her school. They finally relented on the condition that she be home by 11 o'clock. She promised she would be. After the concert, David and Betty Lou made a brief stop at a local restaurant for a soda with friends. Around 10 o'clock, instead of heading straight home, David turned his Rambler onto Lake Herman Road. He pulled into a gravel turnout near a water pumping station, a spot well known to local teenagers. He switched off the engine, plunging the car into the deep rural darkness. Whatever innocent moments they shared in the front seat of that car are lost to time. What is known is that they were not alone for long. Shortly after 11 o'clock, another car pulled into the turnout behind them. It didn't block them in, but its presence was an immediate intrusion, a violation of the unwritten rules of Lover's Lane. Perhaps David thought it was another couple looking for a spot. Perhaps he thought it was a prankster. He may have felt a flicker of annoyance or perhaps a sudden, sharp spike of fear. The figure that emerged from the second car was armed. It is believed the killer first shot out the rear passenger side window of the Rambler, shattering the glass and the quiet of the night. This was likely a move to force the teenagers out of the vehicle. Panic must have erupted inside the car. David, perhaps trying to protect Betty Lou, was the first one out. He was met with a .22 caliber bullet to the head, fired at close range. He fell beside the car, dying almost instantly. Betty Lou scrambled out of the passenger side door and tried to run. She fled into the darkness, a desperate, terrified sprint for her life. She didn't get far. The killer pursued her, firing his weapon repeatedly. She was shot 5 times in the back, the bullets tearing through her winter coat. She collapsed onto the cold gravel, 28 feet from the car. The killer then got back into his vehicle and drove away, melting back into the darkness from which he came. The scene was discovered just minutes later by a local woman named Stella Borges, who lived on a nearby ranch. As she drove down Lake Herman Road, her headlights swept across the gruesome tableau, the bullet-riddled rambler, and the two young bodies lying still on the ground. Shaking with terror, she sped to the nearest town, Berryessa, and flagged down a police car. When officers from the Solano County Sheriff's Office arrived, they found a scene of cold, calculated violence. David Faraday lay beside the open passenger door, a pool of blood darkening the ground beneath his head. Betty Lou Jensen was a short distance away, her face turned toward the road, as if in her final moments she had been looking for help that would never arrive. The car's engine was cold, the keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of a struggle inside the vehicle, no robbery. The contents of their wallets and Betty Lou's purse were untouched. 10 shell casings from a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol were scattered around the scene. The motive was a complete and terrifying mystery. The investigation began immediately, but detectives had almost nothing to work with. There were no witnesses to the attack itself. The few drivers who had been on the road that night reported seeing various cars, but their descriptions were vague and contradictory. Police canvassed the local high schools, interviewing friends and classmates of the victims. They were looking for a jealous ex-boyfriend, a rival, anyone with a grudge. They found nothing. David and Betty Lou were good kids from good families. They didn't have any known enemies. The police were stumped. The crime was so senseless, so devoid of logic, that it defied conventional explanation. As the weeks turned into months, the case grew cold. The initial shock and horror in the community faded into a dull, persistent ache of unanswered questions. The murders of David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen became another tragic, unsolved file in the cabinets of the Solano County Sheriff's Office. Life in Vallejo went on. The spring of 1969 arrived, bringing with it warmer weather and a sense of renewal. The memory of that dark December night began to recede. But the killer had not forgotten. He had been silent, but he had not been idle. He was waiting for his moment, waiting to strike again, to escalate his campaign of terror. The murders on Lake Herman Road were not an end, but a beginning. They were the opening salvo from a killer who was about to introduce himself to the world and plunge Northern California into a new era of fear. The next time he struck, he would not leave the motive to speculation. He would pick up the phone and announce his presence with a chilling, unforgettable message. The shadow that had fallen over Lake Herman Road was about to spread. The 4th of July, 1969, for most of America, it was a day of celebration, of backyard barbecues, parades, and fireworks painting the summer sky. In Vallejo, the atmosphere was festive, the days were long and warm, and the holiday weekend offered a welcome respite from the daily grind. The brutal, unsolved murders of 6 months prior had not been forgotten, but they had been pushed to the back of the community's collective mind, a painful memory that seemed increasingly like a tragic, isolated anomaly. No one could have known that the killer was about to shatter that fragile peace, this time in a location just a few miles from the first crime scene. The setting for the second attack was the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park, another popular spot for young couples. It was more accessible than the isolated turnout on Lake Herman Road, located just off a main road and near a golf course. But late at night, it offered a similar sense of seclusion. Trees surrounded the lot, muffling the sounds of the distant city and creating a pocket of privacy under the starry sky. The victims this time were Darlene Ferrin, 22, and Michael Mageau, 19. Darlene was a vibrant and popular young woman, a wife and mother who worked as a waitress at Terry's restaurant in Vallejo. She was gregarious and full of life, with a wide circle of friends and a contagious laugh. Michael was a friend of the family, a quiet young man who was happy to be spending time with Darlene. That evening, Darlene had picked Michael up, and they drove around town in her brown Corvair, planning to see the fireworks. Around midnight, they pulled into the nearly empty parking lot at Blue Rock Springs. They sat in the car talking, the windows down to let in the cool night air, The distant pop of illegal fireworks occasionally broke the silence. A few other cars came and went, but Darlene and Michael paid them little mind. Then a car pulled into the lot and parked a short distance behind them, its headlights still on. It sat there for a moment before driving off. A few minutes later it returned, this time pulling up alongside Darlene's Corvair on the passenger side. The headlights were blinding, flooding the interior of the Corvair with an intense, painful glare. Michael and Darlene squinted into the light, confused and annoyed. They assumed it might be the police, telling them to move along. A man got out of the car and began to walk toward them, a heavy-duty flashlight in his hand. He was stout, his face obscured by the glare of the light. He shone directly into their eyes. He walked slowly, deliberately, approaching the passenger side window where Michael was sitting. "I thought it was a cop," Michael would later recount. "I was reaching for my wallet to get my ID." The man said nothing. He simply raised his other hand, and in it was a 9mm pistol. Without a word, he opened fire. The sound of the gunshots was deafening inside the small car. Michael felt a searing pain in his jaw as a bullet tore through his face. He was hit again in the neck and shoulder. He instinctively tried to shield himself, crying out in agony and shock. Beside him, Darlene screamed. The killer fired at her as well, the bullet striking her body multiple times. Then, as quickly as it began, the shooting stopped. The attacker turned and walked calmly back to his car. Lying in a heap, bleeding profusely and in unimaginable pain, Michael Mageau heard the man's car start up, but it didn't drive away. He heard the footsteps approaching again. The killer had returned to finish the job. 2 more shots were fired into each of them. Michael was hit again, the bullets causing massive damage. He lost consciousness, his world dissolving into a vortex of pain and darkness. The killer, apparently satisfied that his victims were dead or dying, got back into his car and sped away from the park. Miraculously, Michael Mageau survived. He drifted back to consciousness, his body a canvas of agony. He could hear Darlene moaning beside him. Despite his own catastrophic injuries, he managed to reach for the door handle, tumbling out of the car and onto the pavement. He tried to get Darlene's attention, to help her, but his injuries were too severe. A group of teenagers who had been setting off fireworks nearby heard the shots and screams and came to investigate. They found the horrific scene and immediately raced to get help. Police and paramedics arrived to a scene of chaos and bloodshed. Darlene Ferrin was rushed to the hospital, but her injuries were too extensive. She was pronounced dead on arrival. Michael Mageau, despite being shot multiple times in the face, neck, and chest, clung to life. He was taken into emergency surgery, where doctors fought to save him. He would survive, becoming the only person to ever get a clear look at the man who would become known as the Zodiac and live to tell the tale. His description was hauntingly vague, a short, heavy-set white male about 5'8", with a large face. It was a description that could fit thousands of men. The attack itself was terrifying enough, but what happened next elevated the crime from a brutal murder to an act of psychological warfare. At 12:40 a.m., less than an hour after the shooting, the phone rang at the Vallejo Police Department headquarters. The call was answered by a police dispatcher named Nancy Slover. What she heard on the other end of the line would haunt her for the rest of her life. The voice was male, calm and monotone, with a deep, rehearsed quality. It was as if he were reading from a script. "I want to report a murder," the man said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of the Columbus Parkway, in a park. You will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger." Then the caller delivered the chilling words that would link this crime to the murders on Lake Herman Road and signal the birth of a new kind of terror. "I also killed those kids last year," he said, his voice flat and steady. "Goodbye." Nancy Slover sat in stunned silence, the dial tone buzzing in her ear. The caller had not only confessed to the attack at Blue Rock Springs, but had also claimed responsibility for the Faraday Jensen murders, a connection the police had not even considered. He knew the specific type of weapon used and the location of the victims, details that had not yet been released to the public. This was not a prank call. This was the killer. The investigation now had a terrifying new dimension. The police weren't just hunting a murderer, they were hunting a man who craved attention, who wanted to taunt them to involve them in his twisted game. He had moved from the shadows of a lonely road to the public forum of a police dispatch line. The city of Vallejo was no longer just mourning a tragedy, it was facing a threat. A maniac was on the loose, one who killed for reasons no one could comprehend, and who had the audacity to announce his crimes to the very people sworn to stop him. He had laid down a challenge, and he was just getting started. The phone call was only his first move. His next would be to take up a pen and write his way into history. For the rest of July 1969, a nervous quiet settled over the Bay Area. The police were on high alert, and the public was on edge. The man who had attacked 4 people, killing 3, was still out there, a faceless phantom armed with a gun and a chillingly calm voice. The residents of Vallejo looked at strangers with a new sense of suspicion. The lovers' lanes, once symbols of youthful freedom, were now tinged with fear, their darkness holding the promise of menace rather than romance. But the killer's next assault would not be with a pistol. It would be with paper and ink. On Wednesday, July 31st, 1969, 3 envelopes arrived at the offices of 3 separate Northern California newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. The envelopes were addressed to the editors, with no return address. Inside each was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was messy, almost childlike, a scrawl of capital letters that seemed to shout from the page. The spelling and grammar were poor, a detail that detectives would debate for years. Was it the mark of an uneducated man, or a clever ruse designed to mislead? The 3 letters were nearly identical, though not exact copies. They were the killer's grand introduction, his first direct communication with the world he sought to terrorize. The letter to the San Francisco Examiner began with a declaration that would become his infamous catchphrase. "Dear editor, this is the murderer of the 2 teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman and the girl on the 4th of July near the golf course in Vallejo." He went on to provide details of the crimes that only the killer could know. He described the brand of ammunition used in the first attack, Super X, and the number of shots fired. He mentioned details about Darlene Ferrin's clothing. This was his proof, his way of establishing his bona fides as the authentic killer, not a crackpot or a copycat. He was claiming his work, branding it as his own. But the letters contained more than just a confession. They contained a threat and a demand. He warned that if the newspapers did not print his letter on their front page by Friday afternoon, he would go on a kill rampage in night. He claimed he would cruise around and kill some more people. It was a brazen act of terrorism, holding the entire community hostage with the threat of more random violence. The most disturbing part of the package, however, was not the letter itself. Each envelope also contained 1/3 of a cipher, a block of strange symbols and letters. He claimed that this cryptogram, once all 3 parts were combined, contained his identity. He had thrown down a gauntlet, challenging the brightest minds in the region to a battle of wits. The message was clear: I am smarter than you. Catch me if you can. The editors and police were faced with a terrible dilemma. Should they give in to the terrorists' demands and publish the letters, potentially inspiring copycats and giving the killer the very platform he craved? Or should they refuse and risk him making good on his threat of a kill rampage? After a frantic series of consultations between the newspapers and law enforcement, the decision was made. The risk was too great. On Friday, August 1st, the Vallejo Times-Herald published the cipher. The San Francisco papers followed suit the next day. The killer had won his first media battle. He was no longer just a local murderer. He was now a Bay Area celebrity, a figure of public fascination and terror. The story was electric, a killer who taunts the police with letters and dares the public to decode his secret identity, was the stuff of pulp fiction, now terrifyingly real. Amateur and professional codebreakers across the state, and soon the country, set to work on the mysterious grid of 408 symbols. The killer, true to his word, did not go on a rampage that weekend. He had gotten what he wanted. A few days later, on August 4th, another letter arrived, this time exclusively at the San Francisco Examiner. It began with the words that would give the killer his immortal name. "Dear Editor," it read, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He had christened himself. The name was perfect, mysterious, cosmic, and vaguely menacing. It evoked images of fate, destiny, and a celestial clockwork of which he was the master. In this letter, he seemed annoyed that the police and public were struggling with his code, and he provided more details from the murders to prove, yet again, that he was the real killer. He described the way Betty Lou Jensen's feet were pointed when he shot her, a macabre detail that only someone who had stood over her body could have known. He seemed to be reveling in his newfound power, the ability to make an entire region hang on his every misspelled word. While the police analyzed the letters for clues, handwriting, psychological profile, linguistic tics, the public remained fixated on the cipher. The FBI's cryptographers in Washington, D.C. were stumped. The best minds at the National Security Agency were working on it. But the solution would not come from a government agency. It would come from a high school teacher and his wife in Salinas, California. Donald Hardin was a history and economics teacher, and his wife Betty was an avid fan of puzzles and word games. They saw the cipher published in the paper and decided to tackle it as an intellectual challenge. Working at their kitchen table, they spent over 20 hours poring over the grid of symbols. They operated on the assumption that it was a simple substitution cipher, where each symbol represents a letter of the alphabet. The key was figuring out which symbol stood for which letter. They looked for patterns. They knew that the most common letter in the English language is E's. They looked for the symbol that appeared most frequently in the cipher. They tried assigning it to E's, and working from there, looking for common three-letter words like the and. It was a painstaking process of trial and error. They would follow a promising lead for hours, only to find it dissolved into gibberish. Finally, they had a breakthrough. They started to suspect that the killer, being egocentric, would use the word eins frequently. They isolated a symbol that appeared by itself and tested it as eins. From that small foothold, the puzzle began to slowly, painstakingly unravel. On August 8th, just a week after the cipher was published, they had a solution. They immediately contacted the authorities. The decoded message was not a confession, nor did it contain the killer's name as he had promised. It was something far more disturbing, a window into a deeply sick and narcissistic mind. The message was filled with the same spelling errors as his letters. It read, with slight paraphrasing, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest. Because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is they. When I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and the ones I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." The final 18 letters at the end of the message have never been deciphered. They remain a mystery to this day, a final taunt from the Zodiac. The main body of the text, however, was chillingly clear. It revealed his motive, or at least the one he wanted the world to believe. He was not killing for money or revenge or any traditional reason. He was killing for sport and for a bizarre self-made religion in which he was a god, collecting souls for his own personal paradise. The solution to the cipher was a turning point. It transformed the Zodiac from a mere murderer into a modern-day bogeyman. He was intelligent, arrogant, and operating on a plane of logic so twisted it was incomprehensible. He was not just a physical threat, but a psychological one. The crosshairs symbol he had used to sign his letters now became an icon of terror, appearing in newspapers and on television screens across the country. The game had begun in earnest, and the Zodiac had made his opening move. He had an audience, a name, and a declared mission. Now all he needed were more slaves for his paradise. As the summer of 1969 bled into autumn, the Zodiac fell silent once more. After the media frenzy surrounding his letters and the decoded cipher, he vanished from the headlines. The Bay Area held its breath, wondering when and where the self-proclaimed slave collector would strike next. He had terrorized lovers' lanes under the cover of darkness, targeting his victims in the confines of their cars. His next move would be a shocking departure, a crime of such bizarre and theatrical violence that it would forever cement his image as a figure of pure, almost cinematic horror. He would step out of the shadows and into the brilliant afternoon sun. The setting was Lake Berryessa, a vast man-made reservoir in Napa County. It was a popular recreational area, a place where families and students from nearby colleges came to escape the coastal fog and enjoy the sunshine. Its shores were a maze of golden rolling hills and secluded coves, perfect for picnicking, sunbathing, and swimming. On Saturday, September 27th, 1969, the weather was beautiful, a perfect late summer day. Among the many people enjoying the lake that afternoon were Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, both students at Pacific Union College. They had driven to the lake for a quiet picnic, seeking out a peaceful, isolated spot on a small peninsula known as Twin Oak Ridge. They spread a blanket under the shade of a large oak tree, looking out over the sparkling blue water. It was an idyllic scene, a picture of youthful innocence and romance. Late in the afternoon, as they were relaxing on their blanket, they noticed a man moving through the trees nearby. He seemed to be watching them. At first, they didn't think much of it, but his presence was unsettling. He disappeared from view, only to reappear moments later, much closer, and this time he was wearing a costume. The sight was so strange, so utterly out of place, that Brian's first thought was that it must be some kind of bizarre prank. The man was wearing a black executioner-style hood that covered his entire head and face, with dark sunglasses clipped over the eye holes. On the front of his dark blue tunic, a bib-like garment that hung down to his waist, was the Zodiac's signature symbol, the white crosshairs, 3 inches by 3 inches. In one hand he held a large, menacing-looking knife. In the other he held a pistol. The hooded man approached them calmly. Brian, trying to make sense of the situation, asked if he could help him. The man's voice was calm and measured. He told them he was an escaped convict from a prison in Montana, where he had killed a guard. He claimed he needed their car and their money to get to Mexico. Despite the terrifying appearance of the man, his demeanor was so disarmingly placid that Brian and Cecilia tried to remain calm. They offered him their car keys and the money in Brian's wallet. They talked with him, trying to reason with the hooded figure. Brian even offered to write him a check. The man seemed to consider it, engaging in a surreal, almost polite conversation about the kind of car they drove and whether the tires were any good. But the robbery was just a pretext, a piece of theater to control the situation. The man then produced a length of plastic clothesline and ordered Cecilia to tie Brian up. She was shaking, but she complied. The man checked her knots and tightened them. Then he tied Cecilia up himself. At this point, Brian realized this was far more than a simple robbery. He began to argue with the man, telling him, "I'm the one with the money. She doesn't have anything to do with this." The man's calm facade began to crack. He told them he was going to have to stab them. The word hung in the air, a declaration of such cold-blooded intent that it defied comprehension. Brian pleaded for his life, arguing that just stabbing them seemed pointless if all he wanted was their car. The man replied with chilling finality, "I'm going to have to do it." He then pulled the long, double-edged knife from its sheath and fell upon them. He stabbed Brian first, plunging the blade into his back with brutal force again and again. Brian cried out in agony, the pain incomprehensible. The man had stabbed him 6 times. Then he turned to Cecilia. She screamed as he began to stab her, a frenzy of violence under the peaceful oak tree. He stabbed her 10 times in the back, chest, and abdomen. The attack was savage, a paroxysm of rage that stood in stark contrast to his earlier, controlled demeanor. The assault was over in moments. The hooded man stood over his bleeding, writhing victims, his work apparently done. He looked down at them for a moment, then turned and walked calmly back toward the road. Lying on the ground, his lungs filling with blood, Brian Hartnell fought to stay alive. He heard the man's footsteps fading away. He and Cecilia were both conscious, their bodies shredded, their minds reeling from the shock and horror of the attack. They spoke to each other, trying to offer what little comfort they could. Brian, with incredible effort, managed to untie his feet and roll over, trying to find a way to help Cecilia, who was bleeding profusely. The pain was excruciating, but his will to survive was immense. Sometime later, they heard a fisherman's boat on the lake. Brian began to scream for help, his voice weak but desperate. The fisherman and his son heard the cries and came to investigate. They found the blood-soaked scene and immediately raced to alert the park rangers. While help was on its way for Brian and Cecilia, their attacker was making his next move. He drove Brian's white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia several hundred yards away, and then walked over to the driver's side door. With a black felt-tip pen, he drew another crosshairs symbol, and beneath it he wrote a message for the police, a scorecard of his reign of terror. Vallejo, 20th of December 1968, 4th of July 1969, September 27th, 1969, 6:30 by knife. He had catalogued his murders, creating a timeline of his work. He was not just a killer, he was an archivist of his own atrocities. Then he drove to the city of Napa. At 7:40 p.m., just over an hour after the attack, he picked up a payphone at a car wash on Main Street. He called the Napa County Sheriff's Office. A radio dispatcher named Dave Slate answered. "I want to report a murder," the now familiar monotone voice said. "No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of park headquarters. They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia." Slate, trying to keep the man on the line, asked for his location. The caller responded, "I'm the one that did it." And then, in a soft, almost whispered voice, he hung up the phone. When police arrived at the car wash, the receiver was still dangling off the hook, swinging gently in the evening air. The killer was gone. Back at the lake, paramedics worked frantically to save Brian and Cecilia. They were airlifted to a hospital in Vallejo. Brian Hartnell, despite 6 deep stab wounds to his back, would miraculously survive. His detailed, moment-by-moment account of the attack would provide law enforcement with their most intimate portrait of the Zodiac's methods and personality. Cecilia Shepard fought for her life for 2 days. She was able to give a brief statement to the police from her hospital bed, but her injuries were too severe. She slipped into a coma and died on September 29th. The Zodiac had claimed his 5th victim. The attack at Lake Berryessa was a watershed moment in the case. The costume, the calm dialogue, the sheer brutality of the stabbings, and the message left on the car door, it all pointed to a killer who was becoming more theatrical, more confident, and more dangerous than ever. He was no longer content to hide in the dark. He had performed his ritual of death in broad daylight, in a public place, and had once again reached out to the police to claim his horrific handiwork. The Zodiac was a performer, and the Bay Area was his stage. His next act would take him to the heart of the region's most iconic city. The city of San Francisco in the autumn of 1969 was a place of steep hills, rolling fog, and a palpable sense of anxiety. The Zodiac's bloody performance at Lake Berryessa had terrified the entire Bay Area, but his crimes had so far been confined to the quieter, more suburban counties to the north. San Francisco, with its bustling streets and worldly cynicism, had felt a degree of separation from the terror that was about to change. The Zodiac was coming to the city, and he would commit his most brazen murder yet, not in a secluded lover's lane or a remote park, but in a wealthy residential neighborhood under the noses of the very police who were hunting him. Paul Stine, 29, was a cab driver. He was a student at San Francisco State College, working his way through school by driving for the Yellow Cab Company. He was married, a diligent worker, and by all accounts, just a regular guy trying to make a living. On the night of Saturday, October 11th, 1969, he was on duty, navigating the familiar grid of the city's streets, looking for his next fare. At approximately 9:55 p.m., Stine picked up a passenger at the intersection of Mason and Geary streets, in the heart of the bustling theater district. The man asked to be taken to Washington and Maple streets in Presidio Heights, an upscale neighborhood bordering the vast wooded Presidio Park. It was a normal fare, a routine trip that Stine had likely made hundreds of times. He logged the destination on his trip sheet, pulled away from the curb, and headed west. The cab traveled through the city, the lights of downtown giving way to the stately homes and manicured lawns of Presidio Heights, but the passenger directed Stan to drive one block past the intended destination to the corner of Washington and Cherry streets. It was here, in front of a grand multi-story home, that the routine fare turned into an execution. The passenger, a stocky man in his late 30s or early 40s with glasses and a crew cut, produced a 9mm pistol. Without a word of warning, he shot Paul Stine once in the back of the head at point-blank range. The murder was swift, brutal, and seemingly without motive. Stine died instantly, slumping over the steering wheel as his cab, still running, rolled to a gentle stop against the curb. The killer then did something that has puzzled investigators for decades. Instead of fleeing immediately, he lingered at the scene. He moved into the front seat, pushing Stine's body toward the passenger side. He took Stine's wallet and his car keys. Then he took out a knife and cut a large piece from the back of Paul Stine's shirt, a swatch of blood-soaked cotton that would become his most gruesome trophy. At this moment, a group of teenagers in a house across the street happened to look out a window. They saw the cab parked oddly, and a man in the front seat who seemed to be wrestling with the driver's body. Thinking they were witnessing a strange assault or perhaps a drunken altercation, they called the San Francisco Police Department. The call came in at 9:58 p.m. The police dispatcher, however, made a critical, catastrophic error. The teenagers had described the suspect as a white male. The dispatcher, in the heat of the moment, broadcast the alert for a suspect who was a black male adult. It was a mistake that would allow the Zodiac to slip right through the fingers of the law. Two SFPD officers, Don Fook and Eric Selms, were on patrol just a few blocks away when the call came over the radio. They responded immediately, racing toward the scene. As they drove up Washington Street, Officer Fook saw a white man walking briskly along the sidewalk, heading east, away from the crime scene. The man was heavy-set, wearing glasses and a dark jacket. He briefly glanced at the patrol car as it approached. Given that the radio bulletin was for a black suspect, the officers had no reason to be suspicious. They may have exchanged a brief nod with the man. Fook later recalled and continued on their way, looking for a suspect who didn't exist. They had, in all likelihood, just passed the Zodiac Killer on the street, moments after he had committed murder. When Fook and Selms arrived at Washington and Cherry, they found the grisly scene inside the cab. They quickly realized the dispatcher's error. A frantic, corrected broadcast went out, and a massive search of the area began. Police swarmed the neighborhood and swept into the dense foliage of the nearby Presidio, believing the killer had fled into the park. They found a set of footprints in a nearby garden, but the trail went cold. The Zodiac had vanished into the foggy San Francisco night. The murder of Paul Stine sent a new shockwave of fear through the city. This was different. This wasn't a crime on the fringes in the dark corners of the suburbs. This was in the heart of a respectable, affluent neighborhood. The victim wasn't a teenager on a date. He was a working man, a cab driver, a random target selected for no apparent reason. The implication was terrifying. Anyone could be next. Cab drivers, fearing for their lives, began to eye their passengers with suspicion. The sense of safety, even in the good parts of town, was shattered. The SFPD, led by seasoned homicide inspectors Dave Toschi and Bill Armstrong, threw themselves into the investigation. Toschi, with his trademark bow tie and trench coat, would become the public face of the hunt for the Zodiac, but they had precious little to go on. The teenagers who had called the police were able to provide details for a composite sketch, which, when combined with the description from Officer Fook, created the most famous image of the Zodiac, a stout man with a round face, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and a short, crew-cut hairstyle. The sketch was plastered on wanted posters all over the city. 2 days after the murder, the Zodiac made his next move, ensuring that no one could doubt who was responsible. A letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. The envelope contained another taunting message and, as definitive proof, the bloody piece of Paul Stine's shirt. "This is the Zodiac speaking," the letter began. "I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington Stained plus Maple Stained last night." He went on to mock the police for their incompetence, describing how he had watched them searching for him. "The police shall never catch me," he boasted, "because I have been too clever for them." He also included a new terrifying threat. He claimed he was now going to target children. "School children make nice targets," he wrote. "I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire plus then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." This threat elevated the panic to an unprecedented level. The Zodiac was no longer just a murderer of adults. He was threatening to slaughter children. Police patrols were assigned to shadow school buses. Parents in communities all over the Bay Area drove their children to school, terrified to let them wait at the bus stop. The Zodiac had successfully weaponized fear, turning the routine of a school day into a source of widespread dread. He had evolved from a killer into a full-blown domestic terrorist, and the entire region was his hostage. The game had taken its darkest turn yet. The murder of Paul Stine and the subsequent threat against schoolchildren marked the apex of the Zodiac's reign of terror. He had proven he could strike anywhere, anytime, and his taunting letters to the press and police became his primary weapon. The fall of 1969 and the early months of 1970 saw a deluge of communication from the killer, a bizarre and chilling monologue that offered a confusing and contradictory portrait of the man behind the crosshairs. He was by turns a boastful mastermind, a pathetic seeker of attention, a cunning gamesman, and a bungling amateur. His letters became more frequent and more elaborate. On November 8, 1969, he sent a greeting card to the San Francisco Chronicle containing his most complex and infamous cipher to date. This puzzle consisted of 340 characters and would become known as the Z340. Alongside it, he wrote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. I get an unstated amount of pleasure in killing. I shall no longer announce to anyone. When I commit my murders, they shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, plus a few fake accidents, etc." This threat was insidious. It suggested he was still killing, but was now hiding his work among the everyday violence of a major metropolitan area. Every unsolved murder, every suspicious accident could now be attributed to the Zodiac, deepening the paranoia and stretching police resources to their breaking point. The Z340 cipher was a monumental challenge. Unlike the first cipher, which was a relatively straightforward substitution code, this one was a tangled mess of symbols, shapes, and letters, seemingly designed to resist decryption. The nation's top code breakers at the FBI and NSA were completely baffled. For decades, it would stand as one of the great unsolved puzzles of cryptography, a silent testament to the Zodiac's cunning. A day later, he sent another letter, this one a 7-page screed in which he detailed his plan for a death machine, a sophisticated bomb he claimed to have built and planned to use on a school bus. He included a crude, hand-drawn diagram of the device, boasting of its photolytic trigger mechanism. "The reason I'm writing this is," he claimed, I'm going to get my pleasure showing you how I'm going to get my slaves. The letter was rambling and full of technical-sounding jargon that experts later dismissed as pseudo-scientific nonsense. Whether the bomb was real or just another psychological ploy, the effect was the same. Fear escalated. The Zodiac's engagement with the media took an even stranger turn in late October, when he targeted one of the most famous lawyers in the country, Melvin Belli. Belli was a flamboyant and brilliant defense attorney, known for his celebrity clients and his flair for the dramatic. On October 22, 1969, a man claiming to be the Zodiac called into a live television talk show, San Francisco, on KGO-TV. The show's host, Jim Dunbar, was interviewing Belli. The caller, whose voice was soft and nervous, said his name was Sam and that he was the Zodiac. He told Belli on the air, "I don't want to give myself up. I'm sick. I have headaches." Belli, live on television, tried to coax the man into meeting with him, promising to help. The call electrified the Bay Area. Was this it? Was the Zodiac about to be caught? The caller agreed to meet Belli at a specific location, but he never showed. The call was eventually traced to a patient at a local mental institution who was later cleared as a suspect. It was a hoax, but a convincing one that demonstrated the level of public hysteria the killer had created. The real Zodiac was apparently watching. He was incensed that an imposter had stolen his spotlight. A few days later, he sent a letter directly to Melvin Belli's home. It included another piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt, proving its authenticity. "Dear Melvin," it began, "this is the Zodiac speaking. I wish you a happy Christmas." He claimed he needed help, but that he was afraid I will slip up. He complained of uncontrollable urges. It was a plea for help wrapped in a threat, a moment of seeming vulnerability from the arrogant killer. Belli waited, but the Zodiac never contacted him again. Through 1970 and into 1971, the letters continued, though their tone and frequency shifted. He sent a card with the phrase, "I hope you enjoy your holiday season," pasted from newsprint. He mailed a letter to the Los Angeles Times in which he appeared to take credit for another murder, though it was never definitively linked to him. He sent a bizarre greeting card to the Chronicle in which he mocked the police with a drawing and claimed his victim count was now up to 14. Each new communication was a media event, a fresh injection of fear into the public consciousness. He was playing with them, dangling clues and red herrings, ensuring he would never be forgotten. Then, after a particularly taunting letter in March 1971, the Zodiac, as the world knew him, seemed to disappear. The canonical confirmed letters stopped. For 3 years there was silence. The case grew cold, and the Bay Area began to slowly exhale. The Zodiac became a ghost story, a terrifying chapter in the region's history that seemed to be over. But in 1974 he resurfaced. A letter arrived at the Chronicle complaining about the movie The Exorcist, which he called the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. He signed it with a new cryptic score, me = 37 SFPD = 0. The handwriting and tone were a match for the Zodiac, but the long silence had changed things. The terror was gone, replaced by a strange sense of nostalgia for the phantom who had once held them all captive. A few more letters, their authenticity debated by experts, would trickle in over the next few years, but the reign of terror was effectively over. The Zodiac's final great mystery, the Z340 cipher, remained unsolved. For 51 years, it mocked detectives, researchers, and amateur sleuths. Then, in December of 2020, the silence of the code was finally broken. An international team of private citizens, David Orenchak, a software developer from Virginia, Sam Blake, an applied mathematician from Australia, and Jarl van Eyck, a warehouse operator and computer programmer from Belgium, announced they had cracked it. Using sophisticated code-breaking software and immense human ingenuity, they had unraveled the Zodiac's masterwork. The world held its breath. Would it finally reveal his name? The solution was, in many ways, as anticlimactic and disturbing as the first cipher's message, read diagonally down the grid. The message was just as misspelled and grammatically chaotic as his other writings. It read, with light paraphrasing, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That was int me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber, because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because I now have enough slaves to work for me. Everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise death." There was no name, there was no confession to other crimes. There was only the same pathetic, self-aggrandizing fantasy of an afterlife filled with slaves. It was the ramblings of a narcissistic killer, a final, disappointing message from the ghost who had haunted Northern California for half a century. The code was broken, but the ultimate mystery remained. The man was gone, but his puzzle and his legacy of fear endured. While the Zodiac played his macabre games in the press, a small army of law enforcement officers was engaged in the frustrating, exhausting, and often thankless task of trying to catch him. The hunt for the Zodiac was one of the most extensive and complex criminal investigations of its time, spanning multiple jurisdictions, thousands of leads, and years of dead ends. It was a chase defined by the limitations of its era, a time before DNA profiling, centralized databases, and instant communication, and hampered by interdepartmental rivalries and the killer's uncanny ability to melt back into the anonymity of society. At the heart of the investigation were men who would become inextricably linked to the case, their careers defined by the phantom they pursued. In Vallejo, Sergeant Jack Mullanax and Captain Wade Bird took the lead on the early murders. In Napa County, Sheriff Ken Narlow became obsessed with the Lake Berryessa attack, dedicating much of his life to solving it, and in San Francisco the case fell to the SFPD's star homicide team, Inspector Dave Toschi and his partner Bill Armstrong. Toschi in particular became the public face of the manhunt, with his impeccably styled hair, ever-present bow tie, and the quick-draw holster of his .38 revolver peeking from under his trench coat. He looked like a character straight out of a Hollywood detective movie. He was tireless, meticulous, and deeply driven, often working 7 days a week, chasing down every lead, no matter how flimsy. His work on the case would later serve as the inspiration for Steve McQueen's character in the movie Bullet, and would be famously portrayed in David Fincher's film Zodiac. The primary challenge facing the investigators was the disjointed nature of the crimes. The Zodiac had spread his attacks across 4 different police jurisdictions: Solano County, the city of Vallejo, Napa County, and the city and county of San Francisco. In the late 1960s, there was no easy way for these departments to share information. Cooperation was often informal and sometimes strained. Each department had its own files, its own suspects, and its own theories. This lack of a centralized command structure allowed the Zodiac to exploit the gaps in communication, striking in one area and then taunting the police in another, leaving a confusing and fractured trail. The evidence they did have was maddeningly inconsistent. Eyewitness descriptions varied wildly. The teenagers who saw the killer at Presidio Heights described a man with a crew cut, while Officer Don Folk thought he had thinning, reddish-blonde hair. Michael Merjo, the survivor from Blue Rock Springs, described a stocky man with a large face but couldn't see his hair. The survivors at Lake Berryessa only saw his eyes through the holes in his bizarre executioner's hood. From these conflicting accounts, police artist sketches were created, but they too varied, presenting different versions of a generic, bespectacled white man. Forensic science by today's standards was primitive. Fingerprints were lifted from Paul Stein's cab and from one of the payphones the Zodiac used, but they were often partial or smudged. When compared against the prints of suspects, they never yielded a conclusive match. The Zodiac's letters were a potential treasure trove of evidence. They were analyzed by handwriting experts who noted their distinctive, almost printed style, but handwriting analysis is not a perfect science and is often subjective. The paper, the ink, the watermarks on the envelopes, all were scrutinized for clues to their origin, but these investigations led nowhere. The killer was careful, leaving behind tantalizingly few physical traces of his identity. The investigation was also hampered by the sheer volume of public input. The Zodiac's media celebrity turned the case into a public spectacle. Every police department involved was inundated with thousands of tips, calls, and letters from citizens who thought they knew the killer. People turned in their neighbors, their co-workers, their ex-husbands. Every disgruntled, odd, or socially awkward man in Northern California became a potential suspect. While some of these tips were well-intentioned, they created a blizzard of information that overwhelmed the small teams of detectives assigned to the case. Sifting through this mountain of false leads and red herrings took up an enormous amount of time and manpower, diverting attention from more promising avenues of investigation. The detectives had to build a psychological profile of the killer based almost entirely on his writings. They concluded he was intelligent but likely not a genius, despite his ciphers. His spelling and grammatical errors suggested he was either poorly educated or, more likely, was feigning ignorance to throw them off. He was arrogant, narcissistic, and possessed a grandiose sense of self-importance. He craved recognition and power, and when he didn't get it, he became petulant and angry. He was likely a loner, someone who felt invisible or powerless in his everyday life, and had created the Zodiac persona to compensate. He was meticulous and organized in his attacks, but chaotic and impulsive in his communications. He was a walking contradiction, a man of immense ego and deep-seated insecurity. Over the years, the investigation generated a list of over 2,500 potential suspects. Each one had to be investigated, interviewed, and ultimately cleared. The process was a slow, grinding war of attrition. For Toshi, Nalo, and the others, the case became an obsession, a puzzle that consumed their waking hours and haunted their dreams. They interviewed witnesses over and over, hoping a new detail might emerge from the fog of memory. They revisited the crime scenes, walking the lonely roads and parks, trying to see the world through the killer's eyes. One of the most promising physical clues came from the Lake Berryessa attack. Investigators found distinctive boot prints near the crime scene. They were from a size 10.5 wingwalker boot, a type of footwear sold exclusively through military exchanges. This suggested the killer might have a military background, a tantalizing clue that narrowed the field of potential suspects, but only slightly given the large number of military personnel and veterans in the Bay Area. Despite their tireless efforts, every lead eventually turned into a dead end. The fingerprints didn't match. The handwriting samples were inconclusive. The alibis checked out. The phantom remained just out of reach, always one step ahead. The pressure from the public and the media was immense. The detectives were hailed as heroes one day and criticized as incompetent the next. Dave Toshi himself came under suspicion in the late 1970s when he was accused of forging a Zodiac letter to reignite interest in the cold case. He was cleared of the charge but was removed from the homicide division, a bitter end to his years-long hunt. The Zodiac investigation stands as a testament to the dedication of the officers who worked it, but also as a stark reminder of the limitations they faced. They were men fighting a new kind of media-savvy, attention-seeking killer, using the tools of a bygone era. They chased him through a fog of misinformation, jurisdictional squabbles, and public hysteria. They gave years of their lives to the hunt, but the Zodiac, the ultimate egotist, was never brought to justice. He won the game, leaving behind a legacy of fear and a sprawling labyrinthine case file that remains, to this day, officially open. In the absence of a conviction, the Zodiac case became a fertile ground for speculation, a breeding ground for theories that have pointed the finger at a handful of men. Over the decades, countless names have been put forward as potential suspects, but a few have risen above the rest, their life stories and the circumstantial evidence against them creating compelling, if unproven, narratives. This gallery of rogues represents the most prominent figures in the long and frustrating search for the Zodiac's true identity. Each man, in his own way, fits a part of the puzzle, yet none fits it perfectly. The most famous and enduring suspect is Arthur Lee Allen. A former elementary school teacher and Navy veteran, Allen was a man whose life was marked by frustration, disturbing behavior, and a string of suspicious coincidences that placed him squarely in the crosshairs of the investigation for decades. The case against Allen is almost entirely circumstantial, but it is deeply compelling. He was interviewed by police as early as 1969. He lived in Vallejo at the geographic center of the Zodiac's activities. He was known to own and wear a Zodiac brand wristwatch, featuring the same crosshairs symbol the killer used as his signature. He was ambidextrous, which could explain some inconsistencies in the Zodiac's handwriting. He was described by those who knew him as intelligent but socially awkward, with a manipulative streak and a history of inappropriate behavior, having been fired from his teaching job for molesting a student. Friends and acquaintances reported that Allen had spoken of his desire to hunt humans with a gun and a flashlight, had talked about a novel he wanted to write called The Zodiac, and had even admitted that the bloody knives found in his car on the day of the Lake Berryessa attack were for killing chickens. He owned the same type of wing walker boots in the correct size that left prints at the Lake Berryessa crime scene. He was a fan of the 1932 film The Most Dangerous Game, in which a man hunts humans for sport, a theme that echoes the sentiment in the Zodiac's first decoded cipher. In 1991, a search of Allen's home uncovered what many believed to be a treasure trove of incriminating evidence: firearms, bomb-making materials and diagrams, and tapes of eerie, dramatic music. However, the smoking gun was never found. Crucially, the evidence that could have definitively convicted or exonerated Allen failed to do so. His fingerprints did not match those found at the crime scenes. Handwriting experts were divided, with some seeing strong similarities to the Zodiac's script and others ruling him out completely. Most damningly, in the modern era, a DNA sample extracted from one of the Zodiac's authenticated letters was tested against Allen's DNA. It was not a match. Arthur Lee Allen died of a heart attack in 1992, professing his innocence to the end, leaving behind a legacy as the man who was either the century's most cunning killer or its unluckiest innocent. Another prominent name in the Zodiac saga is Richard Marshall, a silent film aficionado and movie projectionist who lived in the Bay Area during the Zodiac's reign. Marshall was a quiet and eccentric man who caught the attention of investigators due to a number of strange coincidences. He worked in a theater just blocks from where Paul Stine was murdered. He had a background in the Navy and had been trained in codes and ciphers. His handwriting bore some resemblance to the Zodiac's. Perhaps most bizarrely, he was known to own and use a royal typewriter with an elite type, the same kind believed to have been used for some of the Zodiac's later unconfirmed letters. He lived for a time in Riverside, California, near the scene of the 1966 murder of Cherry Joe Bates, a crime that some researchers believe was the Zodiac's first kill. However, like with Allen, there was no physical evidence to tie Marshall to any of the crimes, and he was never formally charged. A third suspect, Lawrence Kane, sometimes spelled K, was investigated by multiple agencies over the years. Kane was a career criminal with a history of voyeurism and psychological problems. His name surfaced after his own brother reported him to the police as a possible Zodiac suspect. Kane had worked at a hotel at Lake Tahoe where one potential Zodiac victim, Donna Lass, disappeared in 1970. He also allegedly knew Darlene Ferrin, the victim of the Blue Rock Springs attack. One of the police dispatchers who received a call from the Zodiac believed Kane's voice was a possible match. Furthermore, Kane had suffered a significant brain injury in a car accident years earlier, which some profilers believe could have been a trigger for violent behavior. Yet again, the evidence remained purely circumstantial, a web of connections with no solid proof at its center. In more recent years, the rise of the internet and citizen detective groups has brought forth a new generation of suspects. One of the most publicized is Gary Francis Post, who was named as the Zodiac in 2021 by a group of independent investigators called the case breakers. This team, composed of former law enforcement officers and forensic experts, claimed that scars on Post's forehead matched those on the famous police sketch of the Zodiac. They also claimed to have uncovered new physical and forensic evidence, including a photograph they believe shows Post with the distinctive scars. They linked him to another unsolved murder far from the Bay Area, further expanding the Zodiac's potential victim count. However, their claims have been met with significant skepticism from both law enforcement and the wider community of Zodiac researchers. The FBI has stated that the case remains unsolved, and many of the case breakers' assertions have been heavily disputed. Each of these men and many others represents a path not taken, a theory pursued to a frustrating dead end. The case against each is a mosaic of intriguing possibilities, what-ifs and suspicious circumstances. Arthur Lee Allen remains the suspect against whom the most evidence was gathered, a man who fit the profile in so many ways that it seems almost impossible he wasn't involved. Yet the science, the fingerprints and the DNA seems to clear him. The others are more spectral figures, their potential connection to the case built on whispers, coincidences, and the desperate desire to put a face to the hooded monster who terrorized a generation. The Zodiac's final and perhaps greatest trick was to create a mystery so compelling that it could plausibly be projected onto any number of troubled men, ensuring that the hunt for his true identity would never truly end. More than half a century has passed since the Zodiac Killer first terrorized the lonely roads of Northern California. The world he inhabited, a world of payphones, handwritten letters, and primitive forensics, has vanished, replaced by a digital landscape of instant information and genetic science. Yet, the ghost of the Zodiac endures. His case remains officially open, a stubborn and fascinating wound in the annals of American crime. The mystery has not faded with time. Instead, it has shape-shifted, migrating from the dusty file cabinets of police departments to the glowing screens of the internet, where a new generation of investigators continues the hunt. The single greatest revolution in the Zodiac case, and in all cold cases, has been the advent of DNA technology. In the early 2000s, investigators at the San Francisco Police Department's crime lab were able to extract a partial DNA profile from the saliva used to lick the stamp and envelope of one of the Zodiac's most authenticated letters. This was a watershed moment, a scientific tool the original investigators could only have dreamed of. The partial profile was immediately tested against the DNA of the prime suspect, Arthur Lee Allen. The result was unequivocal. It was not a match. For many, this was the final word on the man who had been the focus of the investigation for 30 years. While some purists argue that the Zodiac could have had someone else lick his stamps, the DNA evidence has largely relegated Allen to the status of a fascinating but ultimately incorrect theory. This same partial profile has been used to exclude other suspects and remains the best hope for one day identifying the killer. The rise of investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique used to unmask the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, offers a tantalizing possibility. If a relative of the Zodiac has ever submitted their DNA to a public ancestry database, a match could theoretically be made, leading investigators directly to the killer's family tree. As of today, this has not happened, either because the DNA sample is too degraded or because no familial match exists in the current databases. But the possibility remains, a ticking clock that could one day, out of the blue, solve the entire mystery. While forensic science inches forward, the public's fascination with the case has exploded in the digital age. The internet has become the de facto headquarters for the Zodiac investigation. Websites like Tom Voyage Zodiac Killer.com have become massive, crowd-sourced archives containing digitized police reports, crime scene photographs, Zodiac's complete correspondence, and exhaustive analyses of every piece of evidence. Forums and social media groups host vibrant communities of amateur sleuths from around the globe who debate suspects, dissect ciphers, and propose new theories. This democratization of the investigation is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it has kept the case alive, and in the public consciousness, and it was a team of such dedicated amateurs who finally cracked the Z340 cipher after 51 years. On the other hand, it has created a swirling vortex of misinformation, baseless accusations, and outlandish theories that often muddy the waters and harass the families of long-dead suspects. The internet has ensured that the Zodiac will never be forgotten, but it has also amplified the noise, making the truth harder to find. The cultural legacy of the Zodiac is undeniable. He was more than just a killer. He was a cultural phenomenon who fundamentally changed our relationship with crime and media. He was arguably the first serial killer of the modern media age, a man who understood the power of a brand, a logo, and direct communication with the public. His taunting letters and ciphers created a template for future killers who sought fame alongside their victims. The Zodiac's crosshairs symbol has become a universally recognized icon of evil, a piece of shorthand for unsolved malevolence that has appeared in countless books, television shows, and movies. The most famous of these is David Fincher's 2007 masterpiece, Zodiac. The film is a meticulously researched procedural that focuses not on the killer, but on the investigators and journalists whose lives were consumed by the case. It captures the obsessive, frustrating nature of the hunt and the psychological toll it took on everyone involved. The film introduced the Zodiac to a new generation and is widely regarded as the definitive cinematic account of the saga. Before that, the Zodiac was the direct inspiration for the Scorpio killer in the 1971 Clint Eastwood film Dirty Harry, a fictionalized account that gave the public the satisfying, cathartic ending that the real case never provided. But beyond the pop culture iconography, the true legacy of the Zodiac lies in the lives he shattered and the questions he left behind. For the families of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein, there has never been justice. Their loss is compounded by the knowledge that the man who took their loved ones away was never held accountable. For the survivors Michael Majo and Brian Hartnell, the physical and emotional scars remain. They carried the burden of being the only ones to see the face of evil and live to tell the tale, their testimony crucial yet ultimately insufficient to close the case. The Zodiac achieved the one thing he seemed to crave more than anything else: immortality. He created a myth, a puzzle so complex and compelling that we are still trying to solve it 50 years later. He remains a ghost in the machine of our collective consciousness, a faceless symbol of the terrifying idea that a person can inflict unimaginable pain, create widespread terror, and then simply vanish, leaving only a name, a symbol, and a question. He is the ultimate bogeyman, not because of what we know about him, but because of what we don't. The final chapter of his story was never written, and so the book can never be closed. The crosshairs remain fixed on our imagination, a chilling reminder of the man who called himself Zodiac and the enduring power of an unsolved mystery.